I haven't ever been to Portland before. I've been to 32 countries now, but I've never been to Oregon.
We are our own country.
Well, that is something I have learned. So there are three things I've learned on this trip. The first is, this is one of the most beautiful places on God's green earth when it's sunny out.
3 months a year.
Okay, so I was lucky enough to get here on one of the days where it happened, right? Second thing I learned is you have some weird big rigs here with 3 trailers on them, which we don't have out east of the Mississippi. That's voodoo. And the third thing I learned when I came in on the last flight of the night in Eugene the other night, I have not even set foot out of the airport. I am still in baggage claim. And I instantly had a stereotype of Oregon confirmed right there because I smelled the sweet green lady before I got a baggage claim. I'm like, these Oregonians have got the reefer madness going on up in here. Now, I'm not a stranger to this stuff because in Music City, USA, that is always with music and big, venues and things like that. But yeah, so I was like, check, text my wife, you were right. Yeah, right away. It's perfectly legal. So somebody was at the end of their shift and it was Miller time. Right. So yeah, what a pleasure to be here. Actually, as a little kid, I lived for, my dad was a rocket scientist. He worked for Boeing in the the 60s and the 70s up on the SST project, if anybody remembers that. That thing, and we just happened to coincidentally move out of the Seattle area before that project ended. But it was a real tough time up in Seattle, economically at that time. But I remember living in the Pacific Northwest, and so I have a lot of fondness for this kind of weather. And my wife tells me, stop jumping in puddles. And I'm like, I'm sorry. From the time I was 1.5 to the time I was 5, that's all I did, right? Jumped in puddles. So I work for a company. I'm a principal program manager at a company called SentryOne. We make what we consider to be best-of-breed products for SQL Server, okay? The very best of what they do. It's a tool that makes query analysis and tuning much, much easier than what you get with Management Studio, okay? Plan Explore. And if you'll give me the grace to demo it, maybe 3 or 5 minutes at the end, and I'll show you what it looks like and what it can do for you. All of my social media is K.E. Kline. So I'm on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn at K.E. Kline. And you would do me a great honor if we could connect. Also, my blog is blogs.sentyone.com, author/Kevin Kline. And that's in case you want other sessions I've done. I do lots of things that have scripts. A lot of people like to collect all the script libraries I have and that sort of stuff. As Arnie said, we're old timers. We've been doing this for a long time. I actually started my career in the mid-'80s working on relational databases for NASA back when it was a brand new thing. Relational databases were the new cool thing back then. And I worked on 3 projects when I was there. The one that was the most fun was the water recycling system that's in the International Space Station. And we made 96% of the water that goes through a human body redrinkable. And the peak experience of that technologically wasn't actually the Oracle database I was working on. It was the taste test. That was the best day, right? You didn't know which of the waters you were going to get. It could be the bottled water, could be, well, we called it EEF water, the Enclosed Environmental Facility. So yeah, we actually discovered that the water was so pure, there was nothing but hydrogen and oxygen molecules combined, or atoms combined into water molecules in that cup. And so we invented a step at the very end of the process to add minerals back in that makes it taste good. And so if you pick up a Dasani water or a Pure, they've changed the language recently, but it used to say added minerals for enhanced flavor. That was the technology that we gave away. We figured out what makes tap water taste better or pure water taste better. So yeah, and I wrote my first book back in the 80s. It was about Oracle. And I went on, after the Cold War, I left the city I lived in that had the big space center and had the US Army Missile Command there. and I moved to Nashville, Tennessee in the 90s. They had a big Oracle investment, and they were building out Oracle so they could charge people for it. They have a big consulting practice, and so they wanted people to buy it, and then people would say, oh, well, tell us what you run inside Deloitte. And they said, well, we run mainframe. And they're like, well, never mind. If you're not using it, I don't want to buy it from you. So they added in a big Oracle and SQL Server kind of enterprise. And so I was in charge of the SQL Server portion of that. And it was really big. We started beta testing back when it was an OS2 product. It quickly grew to be hundreds of SQL servers. And we were one of the biggest SQL shops in the mid-90s. And that's when I got tapped to be part of the founders, the group of 9 people that founded PASS, the Professional Association for SQL Server. Some people who were around in those days, I keep getting introduced as the first president of PASS, but that's not actually true. I was the 3rd president of PASS. But the reason everybody thinks I was the first one is because I was the president when cell phones came out, smartphones came out. So, you know, if you can check your email on your phone, that's when things start getting cemented in your head. So they don't remember the previous 2 presidents who were there when, you know, web pages were basically like static HTML, you know? So just, whoops, just one of those lucky things. And then I've written a lot of books too. A lot of technology books, like SQL in a Nutshell. And I would like to propose that we raffle off an ebook of that. Oh,
this was my first Transact SQL book.
Yeah. So I wrote with...
1998, I think.
Yeah, okay, all right. Yep. So that was one of my first books with O'Reilly. It was my third book, though. And so let's raffle off one of these, because it's still popular, still in print. And got a new edition coming out later this year. Let's also raffle a full license to SentryOne. So this is the commercial that pays for my trip out here. We make both the broadest and the deepest monitoring and alerting platform for SQL Server. Okay? There are other products out there. I was actually 10 years at a company called Quest Software, helped design all those monitoring tools that they make for SQL Server. I decided that this company was a better place to be. Okay? So very, very deep analysis, very, very broad. You can get everything you need to know about analysis services, whether you're in tabular or multidimensional. You can get everything you need to know about Azure SQL Database or SQL DW. So we cover all of that stuff, broader than anybody else, but then we also go into a lot more detail than anyone else. So it's kind of cool working for a company that has 8 Microsoft MVPs on the product. I mean, we are passionate about SQL Server. Whereas a lot of the other places that build these tools are like, it's a product, right? We're a company that sells things, and this happens to be our product. It's the other way around for us. We like make great SQL Server products, and now we have to find people who might, you know, help pay for them so we can feed our children. So if you are in the market, you would do me a great honor. I would thank you, and my children would thank you for letting us do a demo of the, yes. Yeah, exactly. All right, so that's the commercial there. Just another quick note, we give away a ton of stuff as well. We've got these ebooks that are normally $10 each in the Amazon Kindle bookstore. We'll give them to you for free, okay? We have a really popular website, SQLperformance.com, right here. This is as popular as the other best websites out there, like SQL Server Central and MS SQL Tips. If you haven't heard of those sites, those are great ones. This is another great one. It has a different emphasis than those. So we do really hard-hitting, in-depth articles on kind of nuanced questions of performance. Like, kind of the archetypal one that I hold up is, there's several different ways you can handle nulls when you're comparing values. So you could say, I want to handle nulls for this particular column with isNull. I could use coalesce function instead, or I could use a case function. Which one performs better? Well, we have an article that tells you. And if you're curious which one performs better, the answer is, it depends. Yes, it always depends, right? So believe it or not, about 80% of the time, coalesce performs best. The rest, it's probably about 15% of the time, is null. And then there are certain situations where it's a wash. But case, it doesn't ever really perform best. I'm not saying it's wrong, but if you're writing a function, let's say for the RLS stuff that we saw earlier, and you're going to have to handle nulls, you might want to choose one instead of the other because you know it's going to get called tens of thousands of times a day. Right? And if you can save 5 cycles on it each time it's run, that could add up. This one is also pretty neat. SentryOne.com/resources. This presentation that I'm doing tonight is already posted there. So if you want the video, slides, the scripts, there's not a lot of scripts in this session tonight, but a lot of the other sessions I do are just practically all demos, so you can get those as well. So if you're not a DBA and you're thinking maybe you want to be one, or maybe you've been pressed into service, I have a whole nother session that I'd like you to take a look at on the resources page. There's a couple sessions in there called Who Wants to Be a DBA? And there's a lot of other experts who are well-known, like Brent Ozar and Paul Randall and folks like that, who incidentally I've known and worked with for years. Brent and I worked together at Quest for a few years. Most all of them will focus a lot on technology primarily, and then a little bit of more advice around maybe how to start blogging or speaking or doing things like that. I also put a lot of emphasis in my content around professional development, okay? And so there's a session up there on the resources, Who Wants to Be a DBA? And it's kind of for devs who are thinking, I'm kind of the best SQL person on my team. I'm thinking about being a DBA. Here's the good news. It's considered the 3rd best job in IT, 12th best job overall, systemically undersupplied. There's not enough people, so they've, for decades, been a strong desire to get people into the DBA role, so much so that we have this role called the accidental DBA. You were just, pressed into service, or you fell into it because nobody else could do it. And the average age of a DBA now is 53 years old, which means in the next 10, 12 years, a lot of them are going to start retiring, right? So if you're a young person and you're thinking, 6-figure-a-year job sounds pretty good to me, think about being a DBA. Because what happens on an economic supply and demand graph when supply is constrained but demand is high? What happens to the price? And supply is actually going down, okay? So universities are cranking out a lot of developers, software engineers, programming, computer science degrees. There is nothing like that from universities on the data side of the house. They're not cranking out DBAs. Great question. To distill that question down, we're experiencing a lot of phase shifts. Things change a lot in IT. We live life with a version number. So what we knew 5 years ago is often not really reliable today, or maybe obsolete today. So why isn't academia teaching databases? It's a really tough question. I actually, personally, I believe that it is an issue of, there's a little bit of the ivory tower to it, because a lot of instructors have never worked in industry, right? A lot of the PhDs haven't done that. It's a PR problem. It's kind of a, companies are not telling or pressing enough on universities to say, look, you are undersupplying us in a big way with talent, right? I've talked to many, in Nashville where I live, there's 6 universities. And I was talking with one of the assistant deans to one of the schools there, and I said, how come you do not have even a MIS or CIS degree? I mean, not even IT. They only have computer science. I'm like, well, do we need that? And I'm like, face palming, crying in a corner. It's like, you're the 14th best university in the country and you don't know how important this is? It's one of the biggest parts of our economy. In a $1.5 trillion economy, about $300 billion is tracked back to IT. So like 1/5 of our economy. It's only surpassed by a couple things. Healthcare is one of them. And I think cat memes is another one that's a little bit, right? So, all right, so let's come back around to the topic. Love these questions. Keep them coming. I'll spend all night here if you have more questions you want to. Yeah, I'll do it. So I'm not covering a whole domain of mistakes because they are in the wheelhouse of, let's say, developers or architects, right? So things like normalization. I would say that's a database modeler's job, okay? Lots of DBAs do that, but in a lot of your very strict administrator roles and duties, designing a database is not one of them. So basically, I wanted this to fit in an hour, and so what do you leave in, what do you take out? So anything that wasn't specifically related to keeping a server up, making sure that the users are provisioned to get the access to the right data at the right time, and making sure your databases are recoverable and so forth, that they perform well, those are kind of off the list here, right? Also, most of these have a great deal of additional information that you can get online. So I would never try to write a really big module on indexing because I don't think anybody can do it better than Kimberly Tripp has done, okay, at SQL Skills. All right, so number 10 on the list. One of the big mistakes I see happen all the time with DBAs, it's especially true if it's an on-premises enterprise, there's a conversation that goes something along these lines. The DBA talks to their friendly, very, very friendly and cooperative SAN administrator. Nudge, nudge, right? And they say, the DBA says, well, I'm talking with the dev team. We're going to deploy a new app pretty soon. We think we're going to need 50 gigabytes to start with on this SAN. We think it's going to grow 10 gigabytes a year. And the SAN administrator's like, great, I'll go get that ready for you right now. That was sarcasm, by the way. I like to say, you know, there's some SAN admins who really have bought into the marketing literature from their SAN company. And so I like to tease them because the marketing literature says the SAN is the panacea. It's the cure-all to all of our problems. And in my experience, it has been the central location of all of our problems rather than the cure-all. So what happened in that conversation, you know, however you want to spin it, was we talked about what cost us money, okay? What costs us money is space, right? We buy our disks by the gigabyte. And when you look at industry reckoning of who's the best SAN provider, it's all cost per gigabyte, right? One of the things that we didn't talk about at all, though, is how fast is that SAN? And so SAN administrators, if they've got spinning disks in there, they might configure your LUN as 5 disks in a RAID 5 array. I've done a lot of benchmarking. I can tell you from first-hand experience, a RAID 5 array takes 316% more time to finish write operations as a RAID 10 array, okay? It's 3 times as much, because every time it writes, it has to write a parity bit, okay? And again, the SAN admins are thinking, RAID 5 is cheap. It's the cheapest way for me to configure a hard disk, you know, a LUN for your SQL Server databases and still give you what you want, recoverability. So we have this big, long discussion about what we need, but we don't factor in what we need, the performance requirements. And consider this corollary. You know, part of the reason we do that is because that's the easiest thing to monitor. But let's take this a step further. We're going to lift and shift our enterprise, at least one application, into the cloud, okay? How do you pay for Azure cloud services? What are the units of measure by which we make a payment? Well, there's 2 things. There's actually a new one they just introduced, but I can't go into the details on that. The first thing is DTUs, something they call a DTU, a database transaction unit. Well, what does that mean, Microsoft? The short answer is whatever they decide it means, okay? It's some kind of algorithmic balancing act between the amount of CPU you consume and memory and other stuff. There's a pretty good article on SQLperformance.com about what is a DTU. that's the first thing. The second thing you pay for is data ingress and egress. Okay? So if you're writing really good SQL statements so that you only get the records you need, like Pat had talked about with his RLS security system, and you don't get data for all the companies, you only get data for the one company you need, you bring back less data, you have less data egress, you have less money out of your pocket. So this is what's going to ensure that DBAs always have a job no matter how much the cloud is able to commoditize. Because if you go the next step and think about performance, not just as a thing I buy or storage, but I think about my database system as a performance a set of performance characteristics for a workload rather than a set of hardware, and I learn how to performance tune things, I'm always going to have a job. Because if you can performance tune that code and those queries, and everything in the world is in the cloud, you are the person who can save your company money. Whereas all the other DBAs who only know how to do backup and recovery and fix a corrupt database, and they don't know how to performance tune, those are the jobs that will be commoditized in the next 20 years. Fortunately, everybody in here could retire on what you know right now. So that's the good news. All right, so thinking space, but not speed, not performance. It's a specific example with I/O, but generally, this happens in a lot of other situations. And so I gave you a couple examples here with, maybe they've given you a different kind of fault tolerance. You've got RAID 5, you didn't even know it. You really wanted RAID 1 or RAID 10. Maybe there's only one HBA host bus adapter, instead of having multiple paths, which they call a fabric, you've only got one. So does Azure give you the ability to control very specific granular things like this? Sort of. So what they allow you to do is purchase different tiers of performance. And so it's not fully configurable where you can design it yourself, but it's all spec'd out. So you can see that when you go from, I forget the tier names, but when you go from the commodity cheap stuff to the middle tier stuff, you know more about how it's laid out and how the redundancy is put in. And this uses 7,500 RPM drives. And then when you go up to the high performance tier, you know that you're on SSDs. And so it is spec'd out. It's just not as granular as what you could do if you have the hardware right there in your shop. Great question, yes. If you are running in-house, you're not on the cloud, how many of us are running SSDs heavily? Oh, wow, okay, almost half. I gave the same talk 8 months ago, and it was 10% of the room. Yeah, this is really a game changer. SSDs can make your life enormously easier. They're so fast. There are a couple things you want to be aware of. Like with hard disks, they typically start to give you warning signs that they're going bad. They start getting some error messages and stuff, and then 6 weeks later it dies. With SSDs, if it's a little bit flaky, it's working great 1 minute, and the next minute it's lights out, right? It's gone. You don't even smell any ozone in the air, So that's one problem. There were some other problems with SSDs when they first came out. They had this feature called wear leveling, because you can only write data to a bit in a SSD a specific number of times, about 10,000 times before it kind of wears out. And so they have software in there that says, okay, it's been written to 10,000 times, turn that bit off and enable a bit in the hidden cache that we have set aside. Those have gotten much, much better, okay? So now the MTBF, what's that stand for? Wow. Is it like proximity to Silicon Valley? What's going on here? Most places are like, mama feels really bad about that. What? Yeah, so mean time between failure. That means how long is this statistically going to last before it crashes on you? MTBF for SSDs is actually better than hard disks. About 3 years ago, back when SSDs were just first catching on, I went back to my old data center and hung out with my friends who are still DBAs back at Deloitte, and they had completely swapped out hard disks for SSDs at that time. They saved in that big data center, of course, very large, they were saving 60-something grand a month on electricity. And the heating and cooling, exactly. Yeah, so the SSDs themselves use a lot less energy, but the whole data center uses a lot less energy too, because it doesn't have to heat and cool those the same way it does with hard disks. All right, so I recommend that you do use RAID arrays just like you would for a hard disk. You use them for your SSDs, and different RAID types have different benefits. Okay. If you have a write-heavy workload, RAID 10 or RAID 1 is very, very good. If you have a read-heavy workload, RAID 5 is fine. And then there's another one that I have seen used sometimes, RAID 6, for specific workloads, which I can't remember what they are right off the top of my head. But there are some cases where RAID 6 was a good choice. So if you have a lot of money, the choice is between RAID 5 or RAID 10. If you don't have a lot of money, it's RAID 5 or RAID 1. Okay? All right. Business ignorance. Now this is a weird one, and this is the kind of stuff that my other sessions on the resources page for SentryOne, what it goes into. What a lot of us don't realize is that the database administrator is in many cases the business's go-to person. What is data except a representation, a metaphysical representation of what the business does, what the business considers important, right? And so there's two levels of business ignorance. There's one level of ignorance that we are the IT pro who handles the technology, right? And so I run into lots and lots of DBAs who will say, I'm a senior database administrator. I've been doing this for 10 years. And then when I ask them questions that are on kind of my, my interviewing, oh, you're senior? Let's find out. And ask them, what's a checkpoint? What's the lazy writer do? You've written a regular old SQL statement. What are some things in that SQL statement that might cause its workload to be pushed into TimpDB? And they're like, I keep the servers up and running. That's what I do. And I'm like, okay, here's my thought on this. We're the pros, right? Database often is called the database engine. The pros on regular engines are like the race car pit crew, right? If there's anybody on that crew, even the person who runs out with the gasoline really quick to refuel, if they don't know what a brake system is, you don't get on the team, right? If you don't know what a suspension system is, you don't get on the team. And that's kind of my thought about us as the database engine pros. You don't know what the thread scheduler is? That's okay if you're junior. But if you want to say you're a senior person and you don't know how the internals of this thing works, you don't know your own business as well as you should, okay? So that's the first thing. Have I set a high bar for you? I apologize if that makes you feel bad. You don't have to know all of this right now today. But if you're not curious, you're holding yourself back, okay? So that's one level of business ignorance, but I wrote a whole session about the second level. Back in the early days when I first became a DBA, we had spec'd out a really high-end system. It was the most high-end system that you could get from Compaq Computer back in those days. Anyone remember good old Compaq? Right on, yeah. It cost us like 160 grand. It was a big deal, right? And I was so concerned about backup and recovery on this system. I was terrified that it would crash. And we had really aggressive SLAs and high requirements for RPO and RTO, which I'll talk about more if you don't know what that is. And sure enough, we had a crash. And what really blew me away about this meltdown we had on this super expensive server was what the CIO said. I expected, it was actually the deputy CIO. I expected him to say, what happened to my server? When can you get my server back up? And instead what he said was, what happened to my data? How long before you can get my data back up? and I had an epiphany. I was like, I have been thinking about this all wrong. I was thinking that because we spent 160 grand on this big, important, mini computer practically, that was what the asset was. That was the valuable thing to the company. No. It's the data. And it doesn't matter what version or release we're on, it's always going to be the data that's important. And so it was at that point that I realized the data is a representation of what this company does, what is important to them. Like I've gone to places where the database administrators were managing radiology data for doctors. If they didn't get that data right, somebody could die, right? I went to another place where it was the country's largest floral company. And I was like, I came and visited them there like in a smoky room, like, the painting with the dogs playing poker, cigars and stuff. I'm like, what's going on? It's the middle of the workday. And they're like, look, Kevin, it's busy 2 months a year. The month before Valentine's Day, the month before Mother's Day. The rest of the year, we got 8% of our normal workload, right? And I'm like, wow, this is really, really, and I began to realize these people know what their business is about. They know what the data is. And here I am, I don't even know when the busy time of the day is for my most important systems. I don't know, I would assume it's when everybody comes in and logs on, but I don't know that for a fact. And I'd assume that the busy time of the month is probably at the end of every month when the managers want reports. But is that really true? I don't know. So then that's why I started to first get really interested in monitoring, because I needed to know these things. Like if it breaks at the end of the month when the reports are going out, it's a lot more visible. People are going to be breathing down my neck a heck of a lot more. So it changes the priority that I give problems, P1, P2, P3, Know what your business is about, because that helps you manage this data in a way that is appropriate to that business. And that is the kind of thing that I've seen when DBAs get a handle on that, they start getting invited to a lot more meetings, because hey, we really respect your opinion. Because you know what the business does, you know more than just, oh, well, this select statement isn't written well. You should have option recompile at the end. There's nothing a business person loves more than hearing all your technical jargon, right? No. It's when you can talk their language. That's when you become super powerful, okay? A couple quick things here. Pass.org and SQL Performance, as well as MS SQL Tips, SQL Server Central, will help you enormously with this. They even have lesson plans. At SQL Server Central, they have these things they call the stairway to, right? I want to get good at reporting services. Stairway to reporting services. The last one there, Tech Republic, is kind of a broader website, but what it has that I really like is stuff for that bottom half. Like, how do I talk to a manager who wants this, which is really unreasonable, and I need to tell them they can't have it. It's got that kind of business and IT sort of things in there. Has anyone ever had a manager that does that to you? They're like, I want you to write a symphony. It's Mozart, Bach quality symphony, but it's going to have only saxophones and timpanis, and I need it by the weekend. And like, that's not an orchestra, saxophones plus timpanis. I mean, I'm not symphony composer in the first place, but I know that's not going to sound good. They're like, no, it is. Make it happen. You're like, let's talk about this, right? So Tech Republic is really good for that kind of stuff. Now, here's, I didn't realize this was a mistake until I made this mistake. One of the things that I had happen a lot was when I was a developer, first 6 years of my career, I just wrote code. And there were tons of people I could ask questions to and bounce ideas off of and be told, no, not a good idea. I've already tried that, don't do that. But when I became a DBA, it was just me, right? And so I was in a situation where there weren't a lot of people I could ask for help. That has just changed so dramatically now. There's all these forums. I would recommend Stack Exchange, dba.stackexchange.com. It's amazing. And they have this voting system. So probably most questions that you might encounter have already been answered on that website. Then another one I want to make sure that everybody knows, How many of us have Twitter accounts? Okay, that's about normal. About 30% of the DBAs or database developers I see have Twitter accounts. And when I was first told about Twitter, which was actually by Brent Ozar, I was like, look, there's nothing in my life I need less than one more social media account. He's like, no, you don't understand. I'm like, no, leave me alone. Put my hand on his face, pushed him away. He was right, though, and here's why. When you create a social Twitter account, the secret sauce, the secret ingredient in this recipe isn't having the account. It's in making use of hashtags. That's where we have the hash symbol plus something. And so don't use the default Twitter interface that you get. What you can do is you can pop up only when you have a question. Like, I'm not going to consume this stuff all the time. I don't have time for one more social media account. But what you can do is, this is TweetDeck. The one I'm actually using now is called Hootsuite. And so you can put hashtags on here, and then every message that goes out that has this hashtag will appear in that channel. It's called a channel. Like, my wife subscribes to a bunch of comedians, so all her friends think she is the funniest person on the planet. She actually is, but so she's always seeing comedians, right? If you put out a question, you're struggling with something, you put out a question to SQL help, you will get a top quality answer within 3-4 minutes from like a Microsoft MVP, like Paul, like Arnie, like myself, from book authors, from people who are now or used to be on the Microsoft dev team, the people who actually write the code for SQL Server. Chewy Bubbles is one guy who works for Microsoft who answers questions all the time. I don't know why he chose that. 150 characters is the old limit. That's the old limit. Now it's 260, so you got all the room in the world. Of course, there's a lot of camaraderie, and what you'll see is developed is that SQL Pass is very active, and so there's even a hashtag SQL Family, where people are like, man, I heard your child was sick. Is there anything I could do to help? And it's like, you're in Portland. I live in Nashville. And they're like, yeah, I'll send you a food basket. I mean, people really take this stuff seriously. Number 8 on the list, you don't have a methodology for doing your troubleshooting. The key word here is methodology. You do stuff to troubleshoot when problems come up, but you don't have a step-by-step checklist that produces reliable results for you every time. Okay? That's the problem. I even talked to one group of DBAs at a big enterprise one time, and I asked them, I said, what's the first thing you do on your checklist when you encounter a major problem, major troubleshooting issue? And one of the people on the team, with a completely straight face, said, panic. I was like, haven't you read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? You must not panic, right? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but what I do want you to know is that if you don't have a methodology of your own right now, the great news is SQL Family has provided you with several options already. So this morning in Salem, I did a presentation called End-to-End Troubleshooting Checklist for Microsoft SQL Server, right? So that's my methodology. I have a 5-part blog series that takes you through the whole process if you're interested in reading it. The video is already recorded if you're interested in seeing it. There's also a super good book written by Jonathan Cahias, and it's on Simple Talk. You can get the ebook of this SQL Server Troubleshooting Guide. You can get it for free. If you want the book, that's the only circumstance in which you would have to pay for it. I'm the kind of person who likes to have the analog reading material, so it's like $10, and it absolutely is worth it. And Jonathan didn't have to punch me in the face or anything like that, because we basically agree with each other completely about how to go about troubleshooting. The only difference is that his default is to use a technique called X events. That's what he uses first. That's what I use second. And I use Profiler first, and he uses Profiler second, right? So we just have 2 tools that we switch around. So if you don't know how to do this yourself, take you an hour, get a sandwich, watch the webinar, and you'll be on your way. Okay? Now here's another one. I'm going to do a little demo here on this one. Reactive, not proactive. So one of the things that happens is, I always like to jokingly say that as database administrators, the best you get from management is benign neglect, right? That's a good day. When your boss is kind of like, they're not out to get you. I tell the story about how at Deloitte, I was actually training this new center of excellence we had implemented for consultants who were billing massive rates. And I'm walking down the hall talking with one of these guys, and his manager is coming toward him. His manager's like, oh man, you have been killing it. Bro hug, high five, love what you're doing. You know, that's what happens when it's a profit center and you're doing a good job, right? I'm on the cost center. So I have gotten these databases tuned, everything's working beautifully, no problems anywhere, haven't had a problem for months, and the best I get, my manager's walking toward me, he's like, oh, hey Kevin, how's it going? And he keeps going, right? You know, it's like, that's the world we live in. But that wasn't always the way it was, because when things go bad, they know who you are. That's right. They know who you are, and it's 3 a.m., right? So what I realized was I was managing my environment, troubleshooting in particular, around how much the phone rang. You've already lost credibility if the phone is ringing when you learn about a problem. Because what's their emotional condition? What's their emotional state when they've called you and things aren't? Yeah, it's a negative emotional condition if you're lucky. It could be anger and blame if you're unlucky. They have personalized the problem as you. That's what they'd always say to me. Why does your database suck so much? They were Oracle fans, okay? So a little bit biased, but I'm like, it does not suck. And I'd have to spend all this time. I'd always call up the other members in some of the other silos of our IT departments like, oh, we're playing the blame game now. You say it's my database, I believe it is your network router. And I'd spend the next 3 hours proving that it was their fault. It's their fault. So let me show you the first thing I had to do to really get control of this. And this, again, is another reason why tools became such an important thing for me that I decided to actually get into the tool business. So if you're in Management Studio and you do not if you're on a SQL Server enterprise, you are not currently using a monitoring system. Redgate, Arnie mentioned, really good set of products. We have them. Company I used to work at, Quest Software, also good products. You've got your Management Studio set up here. This is for all versions of SQL Server. I mean, this goes back all the way to like SQL Server 7. If you open up, let me take a moment and find my mouse here. There we go. If you open up your Object Explorer, there is a built-in monitoring system in your SQL Server agent. Okay? So the first thing you have to do, if you haven't already created an operator, this is the person or persons who will get the email or SMS message. So we have super awesome DBAs. That's my team. We could create another group who are the merely mediocre DBAs. That's Arnie's team. And, oh, you're still here, Arnie, okay. Right, and so we could say, you know, what's the email address? I encourage you to have an email address that's a group address, not a single, or maybe like a distribution list. Because what if you want to go on vacation and you're the only person on there? You don't want to have to like forward those on to someone else. I've been to places where it's been going to one person for the last 3 years who does not work there, right? So make sure it's a group of people. And you can even put in like a work schedule. You know, they're only here from their second shift, so they're here from 6 to midnight or something like that. Then you can say how you want them to be notified, whether it's alerts, whether they get a page, you know, an SMS text message, or they get an email, and which of the alerts that are part of their purview. So you create your different operators, and then at a minimum, please, go through and create alerts for severity level 18 and above. The reason I recommend 18 is that 18 is the last of the really kind of predominantly informational messages. You can go as low as 17 if you want to, but that has a lot of noise. Messages that don't really mean anything. 17 does have a few messages that are useful because they apply to deadlocks. But what I would encourage you to do is rather than choosing all of level 17, instead choose the specific error messages that are at severity level 17 so that they will give you an email, right? So I've already got 18, last of the informational ones, so let me go with 19. And you notice they go up to 25. That's pretty small. Sorry, that might not be easy to see. And they get progressively more serious in terms of the criticality of each of these. So when you're at level 19, fatal error in a resource, let me go with 20. That's fatal error in current process. That might be like a SPID, a fatal error in a process, maybe a SPID, a batch failed, TransX SQL batch that they issued failed in an unexpected way. So those are not too serious in these lower numbers. But by the time you get to level 25 or 24, don't drop your fudge, but the server's on fire probably, So those are pretty serious, right? And your response is the next really important thing. You're probably going to want to notify somebody, right? So you tell who will get an email or an SMS text message. Another thing you might want to do is, notice it says execute job, not a SQL script, a SQL agent job. So what I did is I had created a couple jobs for specific kinds of diagnostics, and you might just have a job that has no run schedule that executes Atom Mechanics SP who is active, just to see what everybody's doing when this terrible error message happened, right? And so you could invoke, if you're a Star Trek fan, diagnostic level 1, make it so. And you could have those jobs right there in the agent, ready to go, okay? But just be a little bit proactive. If you have 18 to 25 set up, your SQL servers are going to be much more capable of telling you when there's a problem than you're waiting for an end user to scream at you that there's a problem. And that alone will make life a lot better. It's rudimentary. It's not nearly as sophisticated as the paid products. Of course, I have a vested interest in telling you that, but honestly, you get what you pay for, and this is free. So one of the most common complaints about SQL agent alerting is that if your server is really, really encumbered and it's about to fall over, you might not have the resources to send the error problem, So I have seen that happen where people are like, well, this was a really big explosion, the server really had a problem, but it never told us that because it was such a big problem that it was using itself to monitor itself, so it never got the message out. Yeah, thank you, Artie. And then when you got it back up and running, you got 40,000 error messages, right? All right, so just wanted you to see that there's some, a lot of people don't realize that feature is built in, and it's pretty cool. It's very useful. Now, again, this is another kind of topic. I give it one slide here, but I've seen whole presentations on this about the defaults that SQL Server has built in that are actually not good. When the Microsoft team, the dev team, was building SQL Server, they actually designed SQL Server with two principal overarching ideas, concepts, principles, if you will. One is that we will choose resilience over performance. SQL Server's kind of earliest days was as a departmental level database, meaning we buy it, we install SQL Server 6.5 on it, we put the financial software on it, and we stick it under Murray's desk, and it just runs for the next 8 years until it dies. I remember Murray clearly because he called me up from the Boston office and said, I've heard you're the SQL Server DBA, you need to fix my SQL Server. I'm like, who are you and why are you calling me? I don't know who you are. So Microsoft knew that people were going to buy SQL servers and just kind of ignore them, right? So when they had the choice to set a default configuration setting, let's say, that could improve the speed and the accuracy and the performance of the system, but it might make it a little bit less stable, 0.01% more likely for it to throw some errors, we're not going to do that. We want it to stay up. We want it to, it runs like a train kind of thing. So that's one of the design principles. The other one that doesn't really apply to this discussion is that every query that we issue is issued, or every query that SQL Server receives is issued by an impatient human being who knows where my on-off switch is, and they might come down and beat me up if I don't give them something as fast as I can. So in query tuning talks, you'll see people talking about how SQL Server, the optimizer will try to give them not a good plan, execution plan, but a good enough execution plan, right? So and when we talk about optimizers, we talk about that kind of behavior a lot. But when it comes to our DBA duties of keeping our servers up and running, there's all kinds of settings in there that they never really intended to be for optimal performance. And so you have to go in and manually change them in order to improve them. So one example is max degrees of parallelism, max DOP. What does that mean? How many threads of process, one SQL query, for example, how many can it be spread across? If you've got 32 CPUs and you're asking for 32 million records, wouldn't it be great if we could make each of them pull 1 million down, right? Get it in much less time. That's not always good though, right? And there might be other things like, well, what if we have 1,000 people on here? If the default value for max degrees of parallelism is 0, which means use as many as you have. So a lot of people don't know this, but when SQL Server is deciding in the optimizer, am I going to parallelize this query or not? A lot of people are like, well, it's like the accelerator, right? If it says I need really 4 CPUs to make this optimal, I'll just use 4 of the 32. If SQL Server parallelizes, it parallelizes on all CPUs that you have. You might not want that. You got 1,000 people on this big financials app, you know, and people have terminals all over the country. You might want never more than 4 CPUs to be utilized by any one query, right? So you might come in and change max degrees of parallelism to 4. There's another setting called cost threshold for parallelism, which is actually one I like to tune every time I put a server into production. The default value for that is 5. And that means if SQL Server guesses that the query or whatever the transaction is will take more than 5 seconds, it will try to parallelize it. I think that's a little bit aggressive. And my default number is 50. That's what I usually use. If it's going to take more than 50 seconds, that's a pretty long time. The user's probably going to be impatient by that point, so go ahead and parallelize it then. But there are situations where you want to set both those values. Yeah, you can parallelize it, but only use 4 or 8 CPUs, right? So I might set a value for max DOP and for cost threshold for parallelism. Here's the one that I love, auto-grow and auto-sizing. Does anybody have any 3 megabyte databases out there? Right? And, oh, and it's going to grow by 1 megabyte each time it needs to grow. But the transaction log, it's going to grow by 10%. And that means every time it grows, it's going to cumulatively add up the number. So each time it grows a different amount. Because first time it grows by, what, 100 kilobytes, I guess. And then it grows by 110 kilobytes, or is it 101 kilobytes? And then each time it's a different number, right? This is one of the defaults that they have changed in the latest releases of SQL Server, but only for TempDB. Okay? You still have to know this yourself, that you want it to behave a little bit differently than what those defaults. Don't trust them. It's like setting the cruise control to 35 no matter what road you're on. It's great in the neighborhood. It's not very good when you're on the interstate, because I've probably been stuck behind you at some point, right? Now here's another one that comes up very, very often, okay? I'm not asking you as a DBA to become a security expert, but one of the things I do see is this kind of weird interplay between teams where the dev team is like, well, the DBA creates logins on the database, and they have this grant statement and revoke and deny, so they're really in charge of security. And the DBA is thinking, well, the Active Directory team controls who gets permissions to what, and it's the Active Directory team that is in charge of security. And the Active Directory team says, these developers are writing all these apps now, and they write the login page that people log into these apps. So clearly the dev teams are responsible for security. And at the end of the day, we have 140 million user IDs being sold on the internet because Experian couldn't shoot straight. Right? SQL injection is not the #1 hack in terms of the number that are perpetrated per day. That's actually DDoS, denial of service. What is the #1 hack that causes business damage is SQL injection. Because what is the data? That's the real asset of the company, right? There are places on the dark web that you can go to, don't jump to conclusions, where hackers get together. They have their own communities, right? Their own discussion forums and things like that. And are hackers the kind of people when they perpetrate a really cool breach that they never tell anybody else about it? That's the essence of hacker cred, right? My street cred is how and what I did to people. I defaced the Department of Defense website and colored Donald Trump's hair orange or something. Wait, sorry. Oh yeah, okay, sorry about that. Went wrong on that one. And also, I'm red-green colorblind, so I really don't even know what his hair looks like. But what they do is they brag about it. They tell each other. And then the next thing that they say is, well, Sith Lord 77, if you're so good, show us your scripts. So you can literally download scripts right now that the last one I looked at had 40,000 different SQL injection hacks right there in, it was a Perl script. And if you're buying a packaged app of some kind that is the least bit popular, maybe you're in medicine and you use Epic or McKesson, or you're in some other line of business and you're buying a product from somebody, there's a chance that the hacks are already out there. There are people who are, it's like, I'm a muffler shop. Why would anybody hack my website? It's because they can. And on top of that, it's automated. There are other scripts where you can go into Google and you can say, I want the attack to happen here. And it will just run all these SQL injection hacks against every website it can find in this area. Just crazy stuff out there, right? And again, if you want to learn more about this, you don't have to learn it tonight. Don't ignore it though. Pay attention to the new apps that you're rolling out, the apps that you're buying, and if nobody else is asking the question, then ask those questions yourself. Somebody's got to pay attention to it. A friend of mine who's actually a security expert, his name is Brian Kelly, and he lives out in South Carolina, and he was telling us how his company bought a new SQL Server app, SQL Server-based app, that passed the passwords to the app in plain text. And it was stored in the database in plain text. And guess what this app was? It controlled all the key cards for all the employees. And I'm like, dude, that is so ironic. I mean, you would normally have to be British to achieve that level of irony. Yeah. Okay. We're running out of time, aren't we? Yeah, sorry about going over. This is one, again, sorry? I warned them. Okay. Yes, you did. You did. Inadequate automation. And this is one that has changed a lot in the last few years. I will tell you that I'm an old timer, and I have not learned PowerShell. Yeah, terrible. But there's all kinds of stuff you can automate. And the reason I do all of my automation in T-SQL, and it works pretty well for me. The reason why I try to turn everything I do into a script is because there have been times when I have been working way late at night trying to get something up and running or something fixed, and I'm pointing and clicking in the GUI, and then I literally did something wrong that made me call my wife and say, honey, I'm not coming home tonight. I'm going to be here till tomorrow because I screwed up. Once you have a script that works, you don't have to do that anymore. And I apologize, you do not have the URL link up here, but there is an amazing set of PowerShell scripts called the DBA tools. So write this down, dbatools.io is where the website is. And they have last time I talked to the people in charge of it was just a week or two ago at the MVP Summit, and it's like up to 500 modules. So there's 500 different things you could do in a SQL Server that they've automated. There's a PowerShell module in there that if you have physical access to a server where you don't have access to the SA password, you can use it to get in. Pretty important stuff. Okay, I've got 5 minutes and I've got 5 more slides to go. Let's see. So, don't reinvent the wheel. There's lots of people out there who have built this stuff. Also, 2 little tools you can download. There's a free product called Power GUI, and it lets you kind of drag and drop stuff on there. So it's like, I want to do whatever I'm about to do to all servers, or all servers with this name, this part of a name. And so I want you to iterate through this list. And then when you find each of these servers, I want you to copy a file from here to here. So those are some neat little tools you can use. All right. This is for those of you who are accidental DBAs. One of the things that happen a lot, it's a big mistake, and it is very, very costly in the long run, which is to not do a careful assessment of your options and choosing one. So like Pat was saying, and I asked him, I said, what are the other things that you analyzed when you were trying to decide whether you're going to use RLLs or some other methodology, some other technique? And he gave a very reasoned explanation. One of the things I see all the time, and I definitely did this when I was a developer, was Microsoft has announced something new. And I'm like, yes, that's what I want to do, right? And then everything I do for the next 8 months is just that new thing. I don't know if you've noticed this or not, but Microsoft doesn't support everything it does forever, reliably at all. There used to be an old saying, is it still around, that never buy a Microsoft product until it's version 3, because notification services, where is it now? English language query, where is it now? There's a lot of stuff that they put in there that they didn't support, and there's even a much larger set of features that they really only did a version 1 release on. And so they still support it in the sense that they issue bug fixes for it, but what's the big new feature set around Service Broker? Anybody writing anything in Service Broker? Usually I'll see 1 or 2 people who do some brilliant things with Service Broker. And when it first came out, everybody was doing everything they could with Service Broker, right? And they're like, I'm not using that dirty old transactional replication anymore because Service Broker's here. And they're like, well, I got bad news for you. It's the same version that they had. Here's a little feature for you. Cardinality estimator. We had the same cardinality estimator from SQL Server 7 all the way to SQL Server 2014. A long time. So the key words you want to think about here is technical debt. So remember, as a database administrator, we are the guardians of the asset. You want to be conservative in your choices. Go with what you know always works. If it's a new feature, wait to find out if that's going to be around, if it's going to be getting new improvements added to it. Don't just jump right on it, because what we find is that you jumped on Ajax 1.1, and 3 months later, they issue Ajax 2, which is not backward compatible to 1.1, right? So wait till it's stable. Another thing, of course, I do like to say is a lot of times I'm talking with dev teams and like, I want to do this cool new technology. That's why I got into tech. I love doing these IT projects. I'm like, you're looking at it the wrong way. IT is a tool used by the business to accomplish its needs, right? It's a means to an end. And if you're looking at IT as its own end, you're going to make mistakes. Choose the things that serve the business using IT, right? All right. This is one that's gotten a lot of attention lately with something called DevOps, okay? I find a lot of DBAs who are like, I don't care about code. I don't write the code, it's not my job. And so they don't care about it all. But what happens is when we don't care about how that stuff gets rolled out, a lot of times we do have to recover from that. It's like, oh, this new code that we put into production isn't quite right. Call a halt. we need you to get the database back to where it was on Friday before we started the rollout over the weekend. And you're like, yeah, but people have actually been using the database, and now the data has changed, but you want me to... No, that's not the right way to do it. Don't depend on your recovery for that. What you want is to have a change management process so that when you roll out scripts, you have scripts that can also undo all of that work. So again, just don't be apathetic. Start to learn about DevOps. Start to make sure your teams are using something like Team Foundation Services for Visual Studio or GitHub, all kinds of great tools. Now, when I first wrote this presentation a long time ago, those things weren't really around. But they are, you don't even have to pay for GitHub. So make sure that this is happening. Again, this is another one where preventative maintenance, that's job 2 for DBA. There's all kinds of stuff inside a SQL Server that needs care and grooming. And if you don't do it, like DBCC checks, if you don't do those regularly, SQL Server will not perform well. It will have problems in it that you might not have known about. Updating statistics. Yeah, SQL Server has a method to update statistics itself, but the default up until the very most recent releases of SQL Server was the table that has indexes has to change 20% before it will update those indexes. And what if you've got a 10 million row table that took 5 years to get that big? I mean, it's 1 million rows have got to change. And it took you 10 years or 5 years to get this big, right? That means you could go months and months and months, maybe a whole year without any updating of the statistics. So you need to manage that stuff yourself. Again, this is an old note. We used to have this thing called the Database Maintenance Wizard. You probably have a few versions of SQL Server that have it. Like many things that say wizard in it, like the Database Tuning Advisor, that's another word, say equal to wizard in your brain. The advisor, okay, this is the advice of a 12-year-old child. Got it. That scopes it for you, right? But again, with SQL Family, the good news here is you don't have to reinvent the wheel. At a minimum, check out this guy, Ola Hallengren's scripts. Great stuff. Best stuff out there. He works for Saxo Bank in Denmark. Brent Ozar has some great stuff for SB Blitz, Adam Mechanic. These are troubleshooting or performance tuning scripts. Glenn Berry's diagnostic queries. Make sure you take advantage of what the SQL Server family is putting out there for all of us. And then the number one mistake, backups do not equal recovery. Can't tell you how many times I've had DBAs who call me up and they said, I've been doing backups on this database forever. And it shut down, and I'm looking for a job. Because SQL Server will let you back up a corrupt database 100 times a day, but you can't recover a corrupt database. You have to fix the corruption before you back it up. That's one of the things that Ola scripts do, is it does a DBCC, a consistency check on your database, and if it fails the check, it won't back it up. It'll send you a warning so you can fix it, all right? Now, I would even encourage you to go the next step. In my case, one of the things we did was we implemented restore testing on a regular basis, right? Not backup testing, but restore testing. Because it turns out that we also had to have an application that could connect to that. And so one time when we restored a database, it turns out we did a clean server build, installed SQL Server on it, all the tools and so forth, and it used a different version of MDAC than what the server used. And so the SQL Server was up and running, but the application couldn't connect, right? The other thing, that the secret power of doing your own recoveries on a regular basis is that you learn how long it takes to fully recover the database. So the first time I actually employed this, it was a serious outage. The deputy CIO came to my cube. He was, nothing I liked more than having the deputy CIO sweating bullets pacing around in my office space, right? How great is that? And he said, how long do you think it's going to take to get this back up? And I said, it's going to take 45 minutes. He's like, how do you know? I said, well, I recovered it over the weekend and it took about 40 minutes. And if we account a little bit of fudge factor for growth in data and maybe me not getting right to it, let's say 45 minutes. He's like, great, I'll be back in 45 minutes. I was like, Thank you, God. You know. So when you're in a situation where you've got to recover, knowing how long it takes to recover puts you in the seat of power rather than under the thumb of management, right? Takes the pressure off because you know you can do it. You've got evidence of that. There is one really cool feature. If you're not in a virtualized environment, VMware has vMotion. Hyper-V has, I forget the name of Hyper-V's version of that. Anyone know? Live migration, thank you. You get the gold star. Yeah, in fact, you get a tumbler here. So, yeah, so what you can do is you can actually say, this whole machine, I'm going to move it over to this hardware over here, right? This host. So that's a really very, very powerful way to build your recovery around that. All right, so let's wrap up. Our job is to keep that data safe, to build processes that make the data recoverable, accessible, and expedient. That's what it's all about, all day, every day. Get in touch with me, K.E. Kline or kkline at SentryOne.com. This is just kind of a summary here. Since we're going a little bit over, I'll skip that. And then also, here are all those links that I gave you earlier for like the resources and ebooks and things like that. So with that, it's time for a raffle. Thank you very much, everyone.